Hello, this is Movie Thoughts. My name is John Hastings. This is my podcast where I talk about movies and my ideas about movies. We have a Facebook fan page at Movie Thoughts Podcast. I do this YouTube stream under the username Forager23, and I have reviews on Letterboxd under the username Forager23. This is the 27th episode. So, when I first started this podcast, I had a list of ideas of episodes I wanted to do, and two of them on that original list were one was this episode about I wanted to talk about the film critics who had influenced me and influenced the way I think about movies, and then also the second idea I had was. Or the second idea, one of the other ideas on this list was a kind of autobiography of, or a memoir of how I became the movie buff I am today. So kind of going through stage by stage to where I got me to where I am today. And I actually started working on jotting down some ideas for that autobiographical episode and kind of going back and thinking about what movies were important to me. But as I was putting it together, I realized it wouldn't make sense without talking about the critical the critics who I was reading to. And it also started to feel sort of self centered and not especially interesting necessarily. So I decided to scrap that episode and work on just talking about my critical influences. It ended up, I think it's going to end up being just as self centered as the other one would have been. Um, and as I put it together, I was realizing, it's actually not necessarily that special. So I wouldn't I present this story or this conversation not to present myself as some free thinking guy who's into all this obscure stuff, some type of like maverick thinker. The stuff I'm going to talk about is, I think, pretty fairly straightforward and well known. It's not like um, I don't know all my choices are necessarily obvious, but a lot of them are kind of right down the middle. So I just that's the warning, to the caveat. Um, I want to focus really on the kind of critics and writers about movies and art who influenced me once I was self-consciously kind of a movie buff. I will mention some of my kind of influences to get me into being a movie buff, and that's sort of some of this autobiographical stuff that I'm gonna not talk about too much, but have to begin it somewhere. So one is that um, I did come into a kind of seriously looking at movies in a way through different aspects of kind of nerd culture or geek culture. So one would be role playing games. Especially the Steve Jackson games had a game called GURPS, which stood for Generic Universal Role Playing System, and they put out a series of source books for different kind of genres of uh, stories. So they had a book on fantasy and a book on science fiction and a book on westerns. So you could kind of do role playing games in each of these different genres or milieus or different idiom. And the notes or the recommendations about what movies to watch was actually sort of turned me on to a lot of things that I would not necessarily have just kind of discovered on my own. And I ended up watching things like, for the first time, movies like The Seven Samurai for the first time, partly out of a desire to see if I could incorporate some of that into the role playing game experience. And then the other big nerd culture area, comic books. Tim Burton's Batman movie was a big deal for me as a gateway movie. Really turned me into, in many ways, as being a serious movie fan. That was one of the big influences on me, and through Tim Burton's Batman, um, that's where I first knew about Jack Nicholson, and then went to watch a bunch of Jack Nicholson movies from the '70s, and that introduced me to a whole wide range of movies. And then at the same time, I also got into watching Twin Peaks, which led me to Blue Velvet, and that was the other big kind of gateway for me to become a movie buff. So once I became kind of started to think of myself as a movie buff, and this is I still this is kind of right on the verge of like being kind of consciously thoughtful about movies, but I started reading Entertainment Weekly a lot, and their things like their lists of like the best 100 comedies or best 100 cult movies were important on kind of expanding my scope of what I was watching. So I didn't really agree with like a lot of their critical vision and of their reviewers or their critics, but I did appreciate their lists. That's why one of the reasons I still really like lists today. Um, but those influences were kind of there and kind of in the background once I first encountered my first what I would think of the first real kind of critics who had an influence on me. Um, and I also want to mention now, kind of mention like, oh, Entertainment Weekly was kind of influential in some ways, but I didn't really agree with it. I should point out that most of the critics I'm going to talk about, I don't necessarily would say that I ever kind of endorsed all of their specific opinions on movies, or that I even necessarily think that kind of specific opinions or specific agreement on specific movies is as important to me as the influence that the general approach to how we watch movies or how we respond to movies or how we think about movies has been. They're not completely unrelated, because if I found that I was reading people and I kind of constantly thought that their take on movies was just always opposite mine or completely wrong, I probably wouldn't. That would probably tell something, and it would be a sign that I wasn't. That would probably be meaningful in some way. Having said that, a lot of these folks who were influential on me, I certainly don't agree with them on all movies, and I think most, in some ways, I can't think of a great critic who you would agree with everything on. Part of what being a great critic is, I think, is having to a certain extent, an iconoclastic or idiosyncratic worldview, and the idea that you're going to be on the same page as someone like that every single time out is not. I don't think is that necessarily the most reasonable assumption. But like I say, the general philosophy or their general take or approach has certainly shaped my philosophy. And so we'll start by talking about one of the obvious choices. Kind of something completely obvious, no duh, like okay, of course, like why almost feels silly mentioning, but one of the first influences on me and major influences on me was Pauline Kael's criticism. And I still remember the first time I read Pauline Kael's work. I was actually a neighbor had I was 13 or 14, and a neighbor had paid me as like a little kind of summer part-time job to help them get their house ready for. I think they were. I forget. I guess they were had moved into their house and paid me to like help unpack, and um, so I was unpacking their books, and I found they had a copy of Pauline Kael's Hooked, I think it was, and as I was putting books on the shelf, I kind of noticed like, oh, that looks like a pretty cool book. It's about movies. I like movies, and during my kind of break to have lemonade and stuff, I picked out the book and started reading it, and soon found it was actually keeping me from finishing the job, so I had to put it away. And eventually, very quickly, went to my local library and got the Pauline Kael books out of the library and started reading them. Um, so, Pauline Kael's one of the major American critics. I usually lump her in with Manny Farber and Andrew Sarris as the other two ones who were kind of big for me and kind of big for everyone. Um, you can look back and very much criticize kind of reducing it to those three. There's actually many other critics from their era who are really worthwhile reading, and um, most of those critics I kind of discovered too late to maybe too late to be a big influence on me. Um, but of kind of Kael, Farber, and Sarris, I hit them at the right time to that they really made a difference. But Pauline Kael was the strongest and first influence, and the some of the central parts of her approach, of her worldview, are still with me and have kind of remained with me more or less strongly ever since. And those, I would say, this idea that watching movies is an immediate experience. So movies are about, you're experiencing them in time. They have a performative aspect. They're a performance. It is not quite the same thing as a you know my sense of movies. It's not that you can't be, or certainly you can. Movies kind of, you can approach movies in different ways. My approach tends not to be in the sense of looking at movies as conceptual artworks where you are meant to experience it and then step back and kind of think about what that experience meant, um, disconnected from the moment to moment experience of watching the movie, if that makes sense. And so Kale kind of sees things as performative, as part of this experience. She, related to that, the movies have a sensual element that needs to be acknowledged, and that her critics often kind of strawman that argument by saying that's all she's interested in. She's just interested in the sensual. And she's actually pretty specific when she was specific about it. And, she said that, you know, that's not what she's saying at all, that everything is just sensual. She explains the title of her collection, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, by saying, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang represents what often gets us into movies. So the sensual element usually pulls us in. But she also says that the sad thing is that sometimes all movies deliver, that they kind of don't then deliver something more than just that sensual, visceral element. And so I think she was aware that, like, for her, the sensual was not enough. Um, but I think, a lot of her critics kind of discount the sensual altogether, or discount the idea that the sensual can pull us into a more contemplative or more intellectual appreciation for a movie, and that there's I think some of her more vocal critics have a desire to move the sensual out of movie watching altogether, and I think that leads to sort of a boring, sort of this desire to kind of canonize or celebrate pretty boring movies, to be fair. Um, and of course, I can see her critics saying, like, "Oh, you're just arguing against, you're being a Philistine and arguing against." Arguing just in favor of sensuality and visceral thrills, and that's not what I said. To be clear, I think the what her critics are missing, or sometimes her critics are pushing, is this idea that the kind of sensual or the visceral is kind of bad in its own right, or has a negative connotation to it, and I just think that's not true. I think it's I think our way into art is often through that appreciation for beauty, and for excitement, and for spectacle, as much as anything else. So so the anti Kale sentiment is, I think, like I say, it has to do with this mistrust of theatricality, of sensuality. I've talked about kind of the egghead dislike of theatricality before. They have some of them have this dislike of sensuality. It's the going from egghead to, like, the eunuch view of movie watching. Kale is against this idea that austerity and rigor are the most highly are the values to be most highly praised or sought after in filmmaking, and I sort of agree with that. I think that those are useful. I wouldn't throw those values out, but I think kind of putting them at the top of the hierarchy is sort of anti-human. Um, the other thing I want to mention, just about some of the criticisms of Pauline Kael too, is as I feel, even though this is start, the idea of talking about her is to talk about why her thoughts that influenced me. I feel compelled to at least somewhat step in to offer a comment on some of the criticism I've seen directed on her on the internet when I've talked conversations about her come up on the internet, and I do think that a lot of the anti Kale sentiment comes down to sexism, and I've have brought this up before, and people who would be first in line to point out sexism in almost any other context are often kind of sputter and say like, no, 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 it's not the sexism. It's not that she's a woman. It's like her tone that she takes. She's anti-intellectual, um, and literally, this is not a joke. I'm not making this up. Someone told me the problem with her is that she writes in the often the first person plural, so she says like we see or we respond to the movie this way, and this person said that that was a fascistic tactic because she's assuming how other people are responding to the movie, and if she was a great critic she wouldn't do that. And I think that's sort of bonkers because that's just a convention of how some people write about movies. It's not just her. It's like a convention of how people write about art. It's this more art appreciation way of looking at things. So I think people really go around. I think it is more of this annoyance of a woman butting into this mostly male-dominated world of movie buffs, movie eggheads, that really rankles people. Not that there's not like legitimate criticism of some of her work or her ideas, but I don't think that's what's driving a lot of the tone of the criticism, the tone of it's almost hysterical in some cases. People will get when they start to go on rants against her. Um, I mentioned before one of my film professors, Steve Weinberg. He was obviously he was a good friend of Pauline's. He was my first movie professor in college, and I'd had him as like also a big influence on me specifically. I mentioned that his approach does kind of follow Pauline's in a lot of ways, but he definitely has his own take on things, and kind of what I my own approach has taken from Steve's is that he really seems to me to be one of the few free thinkers who's writing criticism today or writing about movies today. And it probably helps that he is a professor, and so his film writing hasn't necessarily had to be his main gig, so he hasn't had to make choices um, about he hasn't had to be part of the conversation or kind of worried about pleasing editors or pleasing audiences in the same way, and that's led him to mean that he hasn't had to adjust his thinking about what's important or not based on what other people are saying or thinking. And he sends out these great year-end best lists every year to his friends, and they're usually filled with movies that have just slipped by the radar of just about everyone else. And um, it's because it's really kind of paying attention to his own response to the movies and not the buzz or what other people are talking about them. I'll mention Steve there. Uh, the next kind of influence I want to talk about, and like I said, I mentioned Manny Farber, who is a big, definitely a writer I loved, but other people have sung his praises better than I could. So I'll just say that Manny Farber was super important to me. But the next one I wanted to talk about was, and I grouped them in a sort of a weird way. I want to talk about the influence on me of Harold Bloom, who's not a film critic but was a literary critic and thinker, and then of the team David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson. And I linked them because part of how I think about movies has become sort of an amalgamation of Bloom's ideas about artistic influence, the anxiety of influence that uh, artists' creative work is often driven by sometimes subconscious desire to kind of overthrow the folks who they feel influenced from, and often subconscious, not often awareness of it. And then Bordwell and Thompson's ideas about filmmakers primarily as problem solvers, and the idea being that great filmmakers are the ones driven to solve new problems or to solve old problems in a better way, and whatever we want to mean by better, that can be a lot of different things. So I kind of in my mind have linked those ideas, and I see a lot of what leads to great art in this sense, great filmmaking art in the sense of this conversation among filmmakers, sort of trying to one up each other in how to best deal with a topic or best present a type of issue or best solve a problem of storytelling or of theme or getting an idea or character across. So that's part of that too. Um, I mentioned, talked a little about Pauline Kael. I mentioned Manny Farber briefly. Andrew Sarris was the other guy I talked about being part of that big three, and I am definitely an admirer of him and a defender of his work. I like his book or The American Cinema, but even though I would now, I've mentioned before, consider myself an auteurist, and Sarris is that's his school or his wing of things. For me, the big influence on me in terms of my own thinking about auteurism and how I kind of came into looking at movies primarily through that lens was through a message board and the group of posters on the a film by message board. And this was a message board set up and devoted just to auteurist criticism and discussion. And that was like the one rule of the message board. Like you couldn't argue with auteurism there because in anywhere else on the internet where movie discussions were happening, if you were took an auteurist point of view, people would try to come at you with reasons why auteurism was silly or didn't work or doesn't fit with the way movies are actually made. And all of those actual kind of most of the arguments you'd see in those contexts against auteurism had been dealt with in like the preface for Andrew Sarris wrote for the American Cinema back in like 1968 or whenever. So you'd get these kind of criticisms that were based that had already kind of been dealt with in like one of the earliest widely circulated auteurist texts, and so it was pretty. These arguments really didn't weren't that useful or interesting. So a bunch of auteurist minded critics said, let's have our own message board where we will talk about everything except, that's off the table. What has to be allowed for is that auteurism, we're not going to argue about it. It just, we all kind of agree with it. And this really kind of where I got the most exposure to it and really had my thinking shaped by it. And there was a bunch of guys there who I think were really great, thoughtful writers. But I will single out, and I've mentioned him before, I think Bill Crone, his posts there were a huge influence on me, and I've really have adopted a lot of the kind of schema and some of the jargon Bill used or kind of was trying to popularize to talk about movies. And mainly the thing I got from Bill is this, the central question for him about watching movies and why, kind of leading into why he developed an auteurist point of view, was the question we keep in mind is how does this mean, and giving an equal emphasis on the how, kind of the technique, how the what the artist is doing as a filmmaker to get to do it, and an equal emphasis on the how and the mean, so that the theme or the content is also important. So it isn't just form for form's sake, but there's a desire to express something related to human experience or history or the world. And kind of, I think that's incidentally, I think that's sort of where Manny Farber is going with his idea of different types of spaces when he in the beginning of the opening of Negative Space, when he talks about the different types of spaces movies deal with. He's talking about that the same thing in a way. And then for Bill, the greatest directors don't just repeat conventional wisdom conventionally. Their work, challenges or adds to our understandings of the art of film, the technique of how film makes meaning, and also adds to our understanding or challenging our understanding of the way the world works. And I mentioned I've found these schema are useful and some of the jargon useful. A lot of people, even on that message board, pushed back and said, we don't need more jargon, we don't need more schema. But I like, Bill tried to popularize Jean-Claude Biet's kind of classification of different types of directors, which I found pretty, have found sort of useful. That the lowest level is kind of just like the regular filmmaker who's more or less a traffic cop. He's making sure people show up on time. Above that, there's a kind of level of two categories, and you can be one or both. And there above that, there's the metteur en scène, and that shows a mastery of mise en scène, a mastery of technique or craft, a point of view towards technique, and then the auteur, which means you've got a kind of individual unique point of view towards the world. And so you can be either or both. You can be an auteur who isn't a great metteur en scène, so you've got the unique point of view, but not really the technique necessarily to express it, or you're using conventional ideas to express it. And I always think of the filmmaker, my go-to filmmaker for that is Kevin Smith, who I think does have an interesting take on things and has an interesting kind of set of concerns and themes, usually dealing with this milieu of middle class, middle class New Jersey. I think of the movie Jersey Girl, which kind of deals with characters you don't often see in big Hollywood movies. But then he isn't really a metteur en scène. He doesn't really have the chops to kind of really say something interesting about how movies are made, or make movies in a very interesting way. So that's at this level, and then above that level is what be called the cineast, and it's like the total filmmaker. You Jerry Lewis, the kind of the Jerry Lewis's frame, the total filmmaker, and that you're sort of above both metteur en scène and auteur. Like your work is challenging the history of film and challenging the history of the world. You're putting forth kind of new thoughts or ideas, and that's kind of reserved for the highest level. And a lot of people criticize and say, "Wow, that's just more categories for us to argue about." And I do think, again, if they're used as a discussion stopper, I would agree. But if you think of it as a discussion starter or a way to, they're more interesting. And for me, they've been useful as a way to organize my own thinking about them. So I found them helpful. I point out too, is what we're talking about auteurism, that the original in French it's La Politique de Auteur, and auteur theory was Caceres's translation, which again early on he said that was a bad translation. He shouldn't have called it the auteur theory, because theory makes it sound like it's a theory about how movies are made, but really it's a polemic, it's a politic, it's a policy, it's an approach, it's a way to argue for something you're seeing. So I will, I will agree that one of the reasons I like tourism as a policy is I see something important in film. If we look at movies that do have an interesting answer to that question, how does it mean? I think I see tourism as the philosophy that we're pushing for movies that answer that question in an interesting way, or like an engaging way. Okay, so that goes. We started with like Pauline Kael, and then started talking about message boards, and then the last kind of influence or set of influences. There's a lot of contemporary film writers who I do like and I read. I think of someone like Adrian Martin, for instance, who has a great kind of website now with all his criticism. I always am interested to see what Armand White has to say about a movie. Along with Steve Weinberg, I think he's just very much a kind of a free man in terms of the types of movies he champions, and not going along with the status quo. I like keeping up with Richard Brody, even when I don't agree with him. But right now, the writers who are really kind of push me and get me thinking about movies and my own approach to movies are, on a regular day basis, are people who are writing about movies on Facebook. Just kind of some of my, just very often informally. One of the best writers about movies that I know is my friend Ron Salvatore, who doesn't write kind of in any professional context or whatever, but writes really amazing reviews and appreciations of movies for Facebook. And a lot of what I try to do is like just a less good version of what Ron does. Someone else like this is Bill Ryan, who does have a had a blog, which isn't as active as it used to be. The blog was The Kind of Face You Hate, but he writes about movies, shares his thoughts on Facebook. And those are the types of folks who are really influencing how I'm thinking about movies and talking about movies now, and getting to that idea that I'm not interested necessarily in making big statements about things or taking a stand, but criticism as a kind of conversation you have, rather than as this idea that we're going to come to a conclusion and kind of set things in stone. One of the kind of, maybe tragedy is too big a word, but disappointments of the internet movie discussion sphere was that I think it promises that there was going to be all these conversations, but it doesn't really deliver. People like Ron and Bill Ryan, I think, get that right, or their approach gets it right. I think it's unfortunate that and a lot of people who started in like blogging and other parts and message boards, as they kind of became more legit or kind of got more involved in this kind of bigger discussion, as kind of the discussion sphere coalesced into something more formalized in some ways. It became less interesting in a lot of ways. It became more about taking a stand and defending your ground rather than engaging in a conversation. Um, this type of writing, kind of Facebook writing, isn't message board writing, comment section writing isn't valued very much, unfortunately. Even though I think it's often really great, I wish it was more valued. I think right now about someone like the late great Tom Block, who was a film writer who had some, you could find some places on websites he had his review, and I first encountered him. I met him on a message board, and then later became friends with him on Facebook. But Tom didn't just write about film; he wrote about his life, and he his Facebooking, his Facebook journaling was really an art, and it's a kind of a great kind of literary work of it's in its own right. And I think it's sort of unfortunate that's not considered as valid a art form as writing a memoir and having it kind of published in some form, especially nowadays. Certainly, there's a lot of noise out there, but right now, at least, the types of things I'm interested in are more the kind of criticism as a conversation of personal discussions, which things like Facebook and things like doing this podcast, help me, hopefully kind of moving towards, hopefully will help me, I guess, accomplish. I don't know. Anyways, that's kind of brings me to where I am today, and that's all I have for now. Take care.